An alien war veteran warned the council, believed to be mad. But they were wrong. Commander Vethel walked slowly into the great hall of the Galactic Assembly, his forearms hanging at his sides and his old bones aching with every step he took, toward the center platform where the council members waited for him to speak. The hall was enormous and built from crystals that glowed with soft blue light, and the seats rose up in circles around the speaking platform like a giant bowl where hundreds of alien representatives sat watching him with curious or bored expressions on their strange face. The Thul was old now, and his green exoskeleton had lost the shine it once had when he commanded the Third Fleet of the Karathi Dominion, and his secondary eyes did not see as well as they used to, but his mind was sharp and his memory was perfect, and that memory kept him awake at night with terrible visions of what he had witnessed 40 years ago. High Arbiter Pralvin clicked her mandibles together in a sound of impatience, and her 8 legs shifted on her elevated seat as she looked down at the old veteran with obvious annoyance, because she had heard his warnings many times before, and she did not want to hear them again. "Commander Veth, Al," she said in her cold voice that the translator turned into words everyone could understand. "You have requested this audience to discuss the species known as humans, and I must tell you that the Council has already made its position clear on this matter." Vethel lifted his head and looked directly at her without fear, because he had faced things far more frightening than a politician who thought she knew everything about the universe. "High Arbiter," he replied, "I stand before this council not to repeat old warnings, but to beg you to listen before it is too late, and I say this not as a soldier seeking glory, but as someone who has seen what humans can do when they are pushed too far." A ripple of whispers moved through the chamber, and Representative Quilsha of the Meridian Collective made a whistling sound through her breathing tubes that served as laughter among her people. "The humans are contained in their 30 systems," Quilsha said, "and they have no fleet worth mentioning, and no technology that threatens us, and you speak of them as if they were some great power when they are barely more advanced than the Varathi were 1,000 years ago." Vethel turned to face her, and his forearms spread wide in a gesture of frustration that he could not contain any longer. "I commanded 16 dreadnoughts at Kepler-442b," he said, and his voice grew stronger as the old memories flooded back into his mind. "And I had 47 cruisers and more than 200 support vessels, and we attacked a human colony that had no military and no warships, and only 12,000 civilians with a few old defense platforms that should have been destroyed in the first hour of battle." The chamber grew quiet because even the most dismissive council members had heard stories about Kepler-442b, though the official records said very little about what actually happened there. "We should have won in a single day," Vethel continued, "and we should have taken that world without losing more than a handful of ships, but instead we fought for 3 weeks and lost nearly half our fleet to people who had nothing but farming equipment and mining charges, and a refusal to surrender that I have never seen in any other species." "High Arbiter." Pralvin leaned forward on her seat, and her mandibles clicked together more rapidly now as her patience wore thin. "Commander, the records show that the Karathi Dominion claimed victory at Kepler-442b, and that the human resistance was crushed, and that the territory was secured for the Dominion. We claimed victory because they let us claim it," Vethel said quietly, and his words seemed to hang in the air like a dark cloud, "because their commander understood that we would destroy everything and everyone if she did not give us something to call a win, and because she knew that her people would remember, and that someday there would be a reckoning." He pulled out a small device and activated it, and a holographic image appeared in the center of the chamber, showing a Karathi warship that had been torn apart by explosions with bodies floating in the empty space around its broken hull. "This was the Undying Flame," Vethel said, "and it was our flagship, and it was 3 kilometers long and covered in armor that could withstand the weapons of any known species, and the humans destroyed it with civilian shuttles packed with mining explosives, and they flew. Those shuttles themselves, because they did not have drones. Several council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats because the image was disturbing and because the implications of what Bethel was saying began to sink into their minds. I captured their commander at the end of the battle, Bethel said, and her name was Grace Harper, and before the war she was a teacher who taught young humans how to read and write and do mathematics, and she had never held a weapon in her life until we came to take her world. He paused and looked around the chamber at all the faces watching him, and he wished he could make them understand what he had felt when he stood before that human female with her torn clothes and her bleeding wounds and her eyes that burned with something he had never seen before. I asked her why they fought so hard for a world they could never keep, and why they sacrificed so many lives for nothing, and do you know what she told me? No one answered, and the silence in the chamber was complete. She said that when humans get angry, they do not stop until there is nothing left to fight. And she said that we had made her people very angry, and she said that they would remember what we did for 1,000 years. If that was how long it took, Bethel turned off the holographic display and faced the High Arbiter directly. I released her, and I returned to the Dominion, and I told my superiors that we should never provoke the humans again, and I told them that we had awakened something terrible, and they laughed at me and called me a coward, and they sent me here to waste away in diplomatic exile. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow everyone in the chamber could hear him perfectly. I have spent 40 years studying humans and watching them grow, and I tell you now that they are the most dangerous species this galaxy has ever produced. And if you continue to treat them as primitives who can be controlled and contained, then you will learn the truth the hard way. High Arbiter. Pralvin stood up and raised her front legs in a gesture of dismissal. Commander Bethel, your service to the Dominion is noted, and your concerns have been recorded, but this council has more important matters to address than the fears of one old soldier who cannot let go of the past. Then you are fools, Bethel said, and when the humans come for you, I want you to remember that I stood here today, and I warned you, and you chose not to listen. He turned and walked out of the chamber without looking back, and the council voted unanimously to add a note to his file stating that he suffered from psychological instability due to combat trauma, and that his testimony should be disregarded. 3 months later, the Vishan Empire made first contact with humanity, and the Veshans believed in taking what they wanted without asking. Permission Commander Vethalal heard the news and felt a cold fear settle into his heart, because he knew exactly what was going to happen next, and he knew that no one would listen until it was far too late. The human colony on Cygnus 7 was a peaceful place, where 200,000 people had built their homes and raised their families far from the crowded cities of Earth, and they had lived there for 23 years without any trouble from anyone. Captain Danny Cole of the Colonial Defense Force was sitting at his kitchen table eating breakfast with his 5-year-old daughter, Emma, when the sky outside their window suddenly turned bright orange and a terrible rumbling sound shook the walls of their small house. "Daddy, what is that?" Emma asked, with her spoon frozen halfway to her mouth and her big eyes staring at the strange light that was getting brighter every second. Danny was already on his feet before his mind could fully understand what was happening, because his years of military training had taught his body to react before his thoughts could catch up, and he knew in his gut that something very bad was happening to his world. "I'll go find Mommy right now and tell her to take you to the shelter, and do not stop for anything and do not look back." He kissed her forehead and grabbed his communicator from the counter and ran out the door without looking back, because he knew that if he looked back, he might not be able to leave, and his people needed him. The Vishan Empire had decided that Cygnus 7 would make a nice addition to their territory, and they had not bothered to ask anyone for permission, because the Veshans believed that the strong took what they wanted and the weak accepted what they were given their warships, filled the sky above the colony, and their weapons rained fire down on the farming districts where families had been working in their fields just moments before, and the screams of the dying filled the air like a terrible song that Danny would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. The Colonial Defense Force was not a real military, and they had only 87 soldiers with old equipment that was meant for dealing with wild animals and small emergencies, and not for fighting a galactic power with thousands of ships and millions of troops within 6 hours. Danny learned that the Galactic Assembly had received word of the attack and had decided to do nothing because the Veshan Empire was too important to offend and humanity was too small to matter. Lieutenant Maggie Ross ran up to Danny with her uniform covered in dust and blood, and her voice steady despite the horror that surrounded them on every side. "Captain, we have 31 soldiers left, and the Vishans have landed about 4,000 ground troops with heavy armor at coordinate 77 Alpha, and they are heading toward the civilian shelters." Danny looked at his small group of defenders, and he saw the fear in their eyes and the exhaustion in their bodies, and he knew that they had no chance of winning this fight. "What is our ammunition situation?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer would not be good. "We have enough for maybe 2 more fights, and after that we will be throwing rocks at them." Danny nodded slowly and thought about his wife, Linda, and his daughter Emma hiding in Shelter 17 and praying that he would come home to them when this was over. He thought about surrender and how easy it would be to put down his weapon and hope that the Vishans would show mercy to the civilians they had come to conquer. And then he thought about what he had seen in the farming district that morning when the Vishan ground troops had swept through and left nothing behind but bodies and burning buildings and children who would never grow up. "Open a channel to all surviving units," he told Maggie. "Sir, are you sure?" "Do it." Maggie connected him to the communication network, and Danny took a deep breath before speaking to the people who had trusted him to lead them. "This is Captain Cole, and I know you're tired and scared, and I know some of you are thinking about giving up because the odds are against us and the enemy is too strong." He paused and listened to the static on the line, and somewhere someone was crying. "I am thinking about it too because my family is in shelter 17, and every part of me wants to put down this rifle and go hold my daughter and wait for the end." His hands were shaking, but his voice stayed strong. "But I watched the Veshans burn the Harrison farm this morning, and I saw what was left of the children there, and I understood something that I want you to understand too. Surrender will not save our families because the Veshans do not want prisoners, and they do not want friends, and they want slaves and corpses, and I will not let my daughter become either of those things." He took another breath. "I am going to Shelter 17 right now, and if any Vishan gets between me and my daughter, I'm going to kill it, and I am going to keep killing them until I cannot fight anymore. And anyone who wants to come with me is welcome." He clicked off the communicator and started walking toward the shelter where his family was. Hiding 29 soldiers followed him. The battle for Shelter 17 lasted 9 hours, and the Vishans had expected to walk through the human defenders like they were made of paper. They found something very different waiting for them. Danny and his soldiers fought with everything they had, and when their ammunition ran out, they used captured weapons, and when those were gone, they used knives and rocks and their bare hands. Danny Cole died at hour 7 when he stepped in front of a plasma bolt that was heading for Maggie Ross, and his last thought was of Emma and how much he wished he could see her grow up. Maggie took command and led the survivors through 2 more hours of fighting that seemed to last forever, and when reinforcements from Earth finally arrived 3 days later, they found her sitting on a pile of Vishan bodies with a broken rifle in her hands, and Emma Cole asleep in her lap. The little girl had lost her father, but she was alive because Danny had kept his promise and gotten between her and the enemy. News of what happened on Cygnus 7 spread across human space faster than light could travel, and the details changed in the telling. But the core of the story stayed the same. The Vatians had attacked innocent people and murdered children, and a handful of humans had held them off long enough for help. To arrive, the Earth government sent a formal complaint to the Galactic Assembly demanding justice for the dead and punishment for the Vatians who had done this terrible thing. Assembly did nothing because the Vashan Empire was powerful and humanity was not, and politics was more important than justice. Commander Vethal watched the proceedings from his diplomatic post with a growing sense of dread in his heart, because he recognized what was happening and he knew what would come next. Contact the High Arbiter immediately, he told his assistant, and tell her I need an emergency meeting with the Council. Sir, the Council has already said they do not want to hear your concerns about humans. Tell her anyway, and tell her that the humans have been given a reason. His assistant looked confused and asked what he meant. A reason for war, Vethel said quietly. And when humans go to war, they do not stop until their enemies are destroyed or they are dead themselves, and they Visions have just given them a reason to fight that they will never forget. Across human space, people who had never thought about fighting were suddenly very interested in learning how to use weapons and build ships and make the Vajans pay for what they had done. And in a small hospital room on Earth, a young woman named Maggie Ross held the hand of a little girl named Emma Cole and promised her that her father had not died for nothing. We will remember, Maggie whispered, and we will make them pay. Emma looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much for someone so young, and she nodded slowly because, even at 5 years old, she understood that some things could never be forgiven. 6 months after the massacre on Cygnus 7, the human species had transformed itself from a peaceful collection of colonies into something that made the galaxy nervous. Admiral Pete Carson stood on the bridge of the carrier Defiance and watched through the viewport as his fleet assembled in formation around him. And he counted 47 ships, which was not many compared to the Vishan Armada of 800 capital vessels, but it was everything humanity had. Pete was 53 years old, with gray hair and tired eyes, but inside him burned a fire that had been lit by the images he saw from Cygnus 7. And that fire would not go out until the Veshans understood that there was a price for murdering human children. Admiral, all ships report ready for jump, his executive officer announced from across the bridge. Good, Pete said, and turned to face his crew, who were looking at him with a mixture of fear and determination. You all know why we are here, and you all know what the Veshans did to our people, and today we start making them pay for it. The fleet's first target was a Veshan supply depot in the Krath system where intelligence said there would be minimal defenses and easy pickings for a quick strike. The intelligence was wrong. When the human fleet emerged from hyperspace, they found themselves facing a full Veshan battle group with 12 heavy cruisers and 30 destroyers and over 50 support ships that had been waiting for them, like a trap. Lieutenant Commander Jenny Walsh at the tactical station went pale as the scanner results came up on her display. Admiral, we are outnumbered 3-1, and their ships are bigger and more heavily armed than anything we have. Pete nodded slowly and looked at the enemy fleet spreading out before them like a wall of death, and he thought about ordering a retreat because that was what any sensible commander would do in this situation. Then he thought about Emma Cole and the other children who had died on Cygnus 7, and he thought about what retreat would mean to the families who had lost everything. All hands battle stations. He said calmly, "We are going in." "Sir," Jenny protested, "the odds are impossible." The odds were impossible at Cygnus 7. 2 and Danny Cole held that shelter for 9 hours with 30 soldiers against 4,000 Vashans. Pete replied, "So I figure we owe it to him to at least try." The Battle of Krath lasted 4 hours and would become legendary throughout the galaxy, though different species would remember it for different reasons. The Veshans fought the way they had always fought, with perfect formations and sound tactics and textbook maneuvers that had worked for them for centuries. against every enemy they had ever faced. Pete Carson threw out the textbook and wrote his own rules. He divided his fleet into small packs of ships that struck at vulnerable points in the enemy formation, and then retreated before the Veshans could bring their superior numbers to bear, and every time the enemy adapted to his tactics, he changed them again. He used asteroids as cover and launched boarding parties against enemy vessels and captured Veshan ships and turned their own weapons against them. At one point during the battle, Pete ordered the Defiance to ram a Veshan cruiser at full speed because the cruiser was about to destroy 3 human frigates, and there was no other way to stop it. The Defiance survived because Pete had ordered all non-essential crew to evacuate moments before impact, and because human engineers had built the ship tough enough to take the hit. The Veshan cruiser did not survive. When the battle finally ended, the human fleet had lost 19 ships, and hundreds of brave men and women had given their lives. But the Veshan battle group had been completely destroyed, and not one enemy vessel escaped to tell the tale. Pete stood on his damaged bridge surrounded by exhausted crew members who could barely believe they were still alive, and he sent a single message back to Earth: the debt has begun to be paid. News of the Battle of Krath reached the Galactic Assembly within hours, and High Arbiter Pralvin called an emergency session to discuss what had happened. This is an outrage, the Veshan ambassador screamed, with his scales rippling in fury. The humans have committed an act of war against a sovereign power, and the Assembly must respond with force. The humans claim it was retaliation for Cygnus 7. Representative Quilsha pointed out, retaliation for disciplining a few colonists who resisted lawful Veshan expansion. The ambassador demanded, that is no justification for this unprovoked attack. Commander Vethel stepped forward from his position at the back of the chamber. May I speak, High Arbiter? Pralvin hesitated because she remembered what had happened the last time Vethel addressed the council, but she nodded because protocol required her to let him speak. I warned this council that humans were dangerous, and you dismissed my concerns, and now perhaps you understand why I was so worried. He said, your empire attacked a human civilian colony and killed their children, and you expected them to accept it quietly. We expected them to know their place. The Veshan ambassador spat. That is exactly your mistake, because humans do not have a place, and they do not accept being told what they can and cannot do. Vethel replied, I have studied them for 40 years, and they are not like us, and when we face a stronger enemy, we calculate the odds and negotiate or submit, if necessary. But humans do not submit, and they do not negotiate, and they find ways to win that we cannot imagine. They are primitives. The ambassador insisted. This victory was luck and nothing more. Perhaps it was luck, or perhaps you have awakened something that cannot be put back to sleep. Vethel said, the humans have a saying about letting sleeping dogs lie, and your empire kicked the dog, and now it is awake and very angry. The Veshan ambassador demanded that the assembly authorize military action against humanity, and a vote was scheduled for the following week. The vote never happened. 3 days before it was supposed to take place, the human fleet struck again and destroyed a Veshan convoy carrying supplies to their forward bases, and then they struck again and destroyed a Veshan shipyard that was building new warships, and then they struck again and again and again. Within a month, the Veshan Empire had lost 47 ships and 3 major bases and control of an entire sector that they had held for centuries. Admiral Pete Carson and his fleet were everywhere and nowhere, and every time the Veshans thought they had him cornered, he slipped away and appeared somewhere else to cause more damage. A young captain named Maggie Ross had joined the fleet and earned a reputation as the most aggressive commander in the human navy, and she led a squadron of destroyers that the Veshans learned to fear more than any other. She had made a promise to a little girl named Emma Cole, and she intended to keep it no matter what it cost her. The Galactic Assembly watched in growing alarm as the war between humanity and the Veshan Empire spiraled out of control, and even species that had dismissed humans as primitives began to wonder if they had underestimated them. Commander Vethel watched too, and he felt no satisfaction in being proven right, because he knew that the worst was yet to come. The Vishans would not accept defeat, and they would call in favors from their allies, and eventually they would assemble a force large enough to crush humanity once and for all. And when that happened, the humans would not surrender, and they would not run, and they would fight to the last man and woman and child in the galaxy would burn. We have to stop this, Vethel said to himself late one night as he watched the war reports come in. There has to be another way. But he did not know what that way might be, and time was running out for everyone. 1 year into the war, the galaxy had learned to fear a name that had once belonged to a young lieutenant who held a shelter on Cygnus 7 with 30 soldiers against an army. Captain Maggie Ross now commanded a destroyer squadron called the Iron Wolves, and they had destroyed more Vishan ships than any other unit in the human fleet, and the enemy had placed a bounty on her head that was larger than the budget of some small planets. She had been offered promotion to Admiral 3 times, and she had refused every offer. "I do not want a desk," she told Admiral Carson when he asked her why. "I want to be out there in the fight where I can make a difference, and I owe that to Danny and to everyone we lost on Cygnus 7. Pete understood because he had his own ghost that kept him fighting. When his body wanted to rest, the war had changed everything for both sides, and the Vishans, who had expected a quick victory over primitive humans, found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to die. No matter how many ships they sent, human tactics evolved faster than anyone could believe possible, and every time the Vishans found a counter to human strategies, the humans changed their approach and developed new weapons that made even veteran Vishan commanders hesitate before engaging. The most terrifying human weapon was something they called a grinder, and it was simple in design but devastating in effect. Grinder was a small unmanned craft packed with explosives and guided by a basic computer that could be produced cheaply and deployed in large numbers, and when they swarmed a Vishan ship, there was almost nothing the enemy could do to stop them. The Vishans called them demon seeds, and they feared them more than any human warship. Maggie called them justice. She was leading a strike against a Vishan shipyard when her communications officer reported an incoming signal on a frequency that nobody recognized. "Captain, we are receiving a transmission, but it is not coming from a Vishan source, and the language is not in our database." Maggie frowned because unexpected communications in the middle of a combat zone were usually bad news. "Put it through, and let me hear what they want." The voice that filled the bridge was calm and measured and spoke perfect English with an accent that sounded almost musical. "Captain Ross, my name is Commander Vethel of the Karathi Dominion, and I believe we have much to discuss if you are willing to listen." Maggie's hand moved to her sidearm without her thinking about it, because the Karathi were members of the Galactic Assembly, and the Assembly had done nothing to help humanity when the Vishans attacked. "Why should I trust anything a Karathi has to say when your Assembly abandoned my people to die? Because I warned the Assembly about your species 40 years ago, and they thought I was mad and called me unstable and sent me away," Vethel replied. "And I believe you will not make the same mistake of underestimating me." Despite herself, Maggie laughed because she had heard stories about the crazy Karathi veteran who kept telling everyone that humans were dangerous. "You are the one who fought at Kepler 442b and met Grace Harper." "I am, and I have studied humanity ever since because I knew that someday the galaxy would need to understand what you are capable of," Vethel said, "and that day has come sooner than I expected. What do you want from me?" "I want to warn you about something that will happen very soon if you do not take action to prevent it." Maggie listened as Vethel explained what he had learned from his contacts within the Assembly, and what he told her made her blood run cold. "The Vishans have convinced the Council that humanity is too dangerous to be allowed to exist, and they are assembling a coalition fleet from 12 different Species with over 2,000 ships, and they plan to attack Earth and destroy every human world and exterminate your entire species. The bridge fell silent as everyone absorbed the horror of what the old alien was saying. "Why are you telling me this?" Maggie asked. "Your people are part of the assembly, and you should want to see us destroyed. Because I watched you for a year, and I calculated the odds, and I know what will happen if the coalition attacks." Vethel replied, "Humanity will lose because you cannot fight 2,000 ships, but you will make the enemy bleed so badly that the victory will be meaningless and billions will die on both sides and the galaxy will be wounded in ways that may never heal. So you want us to surrender?" "No, because I know you will never surrender, and that is exactly why I'm talking to you instead of someone else." Vethel said, "I want to help you prevent this war from becoming a catastrophe for everyone." "How?" "By fighting smart instead of fighting hard," he replied. "I have information that could fracture the coalition and turn some of your enemies into allies, or at least into neutral parties who will not join the attack." Maggie thought about this for a long moment, and she thought about Danny, Cole, and Emma, and all the people who had died, and all the people who would die if this war continued to escalate. What kind of information? Evidence of Veshan atrocities against dozens of species over centuries, and records that the Assembly has suppressed because the Veshans were too powerful to challenge. Vethal explained, "If this evidence reaches the right people, the coalition will fall apart before it can launch." "Why have you not released this yourself?" "Because I'm one old Korathi veteran with no credibility, and everyone thinks I am insane," he said with something that might have been humor in his voice. "But you are the Iron Wolf, and you are the human who held Cygnus 7, and when you speak, the galaxy listens." Maggie was quiet for a long time as she weighed the risks and the possibilities, and the chance that this could be a trap designed to capture or kill her. "Give me coordinates for a meeting," she said finally. "But understand something, Commander, and understand it well." "Yes. If this is a trap, I will find a way to make you regret it, even if it is the last thing I ever do, and I will burn everything you love before I die." "I would expect nothing less from you, Captain, and that is precisely why I chose to contact you instead of someone else." Vethal replied, "You are exactly what humanity needs right now, and I believe we can help each other." The line went dead, and Maggie stood in silence for several seconds before turning to her crew, abort the attack on the shipyard, and set course for the rendezvous coordinates. Her executive officer stared at her with obvious concern. "Captain, are you sure about this? Because it could be a trap." "It could be," Maggie agreed. "But if what he says is true, then we need that information more than we need another destroyed shipyard. And if he is lying, then we can always kill him and attack the shipyard later." She smiled grimly as her ship turned away from the enemy base and headed toward the unknown. "Besides, I have always wanted to meet the crazy Korathi who figured out humans 40 years before anyone else did." Somewhere in the depths of space, Commander Vethel ended the transmission and allowed himself a moment of hope that he had not felt in a very long time. Perhaps there was still a way to save the galaxy from tearing itself apart. Perhaps the humans could be the key to a better future instead of the architects of total destruction. Or perhaps he really was as mad as everyone believed, and this would all end in fire and death. Only time would tell. The meeting took place on a dead moon at the edge of assembly space, where no one would think to look, and where the silence was so complete that it felt like the universe was holding its breath. Captain Maggie Ross brought 3 ships and 200 Marines because she was not foolish enough to trust anyone completely, and she had learned that lesson the hard way on. Cygnus 7 Commander Vethel brought himself and a small data pad and nothing else because he wanted to prove that his intentions were honest. "You came alone," Maggie observed as she stepped off her shuttle with her hand resting on her weapon. that is either very brave or very stupid. It is practical. Vethel replied, and his forearms spread wide in a gesture of openness. I calculated that if I brought a fleet, you would simply destroy it, and then we would have no chance to talk. You are not wrong about that. Maggie studied the old veteran carefully, and she saw that he was smaller than she had expected, with a dull exoskeleton that showed his age, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent, and she understood why he had survived for so long in a galaxy that wanted to forget him. Show me what you have, she said. Vethel activated his datapad, and a holographic display flickered to life, showing a map of the galaxy with all the major powers marked in different colors. The Coalition fleet is assembling at Vashon Prime, and they plan to launch in 3 weeks, and their first target will be Earth because they believe that destroying your homeworld will break human morale and end the war quickly. It will not break us, Maggie said, and her voice was hard as steel. I know, and that is what I have tried to tell them, but they do not understand humans the way I do, Vethel replied. However, the Coalition is not as strong as it appears, because several species joined only because they were pressured or threatened by the Vashons. He pointed to several marks on the map. The Meridian Collective and the Kashra Union and the Vorathi Confederation all have doubts about this war, and they do not want to commit genocide against a species that has done nothing to them. Doubts do not stop fleets from attacking. No, but information might, Vedala said, and he handed her the datapad. This contains evidence of Veshan atrocities against dozens of species over hundreds of years, and the Assembly has hidden this information because the Veshans were too powerful to challenge, but you are not bound by their politics. Maggie scrolled through the files, and her stomach turned at what she saw because the images were horrible, and the scale of suffering was beyond anything she had imagined. Why have you not released this yourself? Because I am one old veteran that everyone believes is insane, and no one would listen to me, Vethel explained. But you are the Iron Wolf, and you are a hero to your people, and when you speak, the galaxy pays attention. Even if I release this, it will not stop the Coalition completely. It does not need to stop them completely, he said. It only needs to fracture them enough that the attack becomes impossible, and in that fracture there is opportunity for something better. Maggie looked at the evidence on the datapad, and then she looked at the old Karathi who had spent 40 years trying to warn everyone about humanity. Why are you really doing this? She asked. And I want the truth. Vethel was silent for a moment, and then he reached into his uniform and pulled out a small device that projected a holographic recording. This is from Kepler 442b from the day I captured Grace Harper. The image showed a younger Vethel, with a shining exoskeleton standing before a human woman who was battered and bleeding, but not defeated. You fought well, the younger Vethel said. Your species has potential, and it is a shame you must die. Grace Harper lifted her head, and her eyes burned with something that made Maggie's breath catch in her throat. I will not die here, Commander, and neither will my people. You cannot win because your colony is destroyed and your defenders are dead. That is true, Grace said, and she smiled in a way that was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. But you made a mistake when you attacked us because you taught us that we can hurt you, and humans have very long memories. The recording ended, and Vethel looked at Maggie with eyes that had seen too much. I released her because I saw something in her eyes that I had never seen before, and it scared me more than anything I had faced in all my years of war, he said. And I have seen that same thing in the eyes of every human I have met since then. What did you see? The absolute certainty that you will find a way to win no matter the odds and no matter the cost, he replied. And I do not want to see what happens when humanity has nothing left to lose, because the galaxy does not deserve that fate. Maggie thought about Danny Cole and Emma, and all the people who had suffered and died, and she thought about what kind of future she wanted to build. All right, she said finally, let us save the galaxy together. The evidence was released 3 days later through channels that could not be traced, and the effect was immediate and devastating to the coalition. 5 species withdrew their support for the attack, and 3 more demanded investigations into Vishan conduct over the centuries, and the assembly dissolved into chaos as old grudges and hidden resentments boiled to the surface. The coalition fleet never launched against Earth. Instead, that Veshan Empire found itself facing something worse than human vengeance, because now the entire galaxy was looking at them with new eyes, and species that had looked away for centuries now demanded answers. Within a year, the Veshans had signed a peace treaty with humanity, and the terms were harsh, but not as harsh as they could have been. Admiral Maggie Ross stood beside Commander Vethal at the signing ceremony and watched as the Veshan ambassador put his seal on the document that ended the war. "You could have demanded more," Vethal observed. "Your people suffered greatly, and they would have supported harsher punishment. We did not fight this war to become the thing we were fighting against," Maggie replied. "That is a remarkable perspective, because most species would not show such restraint after everything that was done to them." "We are not most species," Maggie said, and she smiled slightly. "But we do have long memories, and if the Vishans ever try anything like Cygnus 7 again, they will find us waiting. Of that I have no doubt." They watched as representatives from across the galaxy witnessed the treaty signing and murmured among themselves about what this meant for the future. "What happens now?" Vethel asked. Maggie thought about Danny Cole, who had died protecting his daughter, and about Emma, who had grown into a fierce young woman with her father's courage, and about Grace Harper, who had become a legend. "Now we build something better," she said, "together with anyone who wants to help." Vethel considered this, and then slowly he extended one of his arms toward her. "Together," he agreed. Maggie took his hand and shook it, and the galaxy watched and began to understand what it truly meant to be human. Not the violence and not the vengeance, but the unbreakable belief that tomorrow could be better than today, and the willingness to fight for that belief no matter what stood in the way. That was the real danger that Commander Vethel had warned the Council about all those years ago. That was why they had been wrong to dismiss him as mad. And that was why, in the end, humanity had not just survived, but had changed the galaxy forever. Because humans do not stop, and they do not surrender, and they do not forget. And when they decide that something is worth fighting for, they will find a way to win, no matter what. The end.